So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well as many types of religious.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Preston.
This is an exciting opportunity for us. It's been a while since we've had an interview on the show with somebody who has escaped a cult.
And introduced us by our previous cult escapee. So that's cool.
Right? This will be another good one on the Holy Watermelon
Podcast.
We never sync up properly when we do these interviews. One day we'll figure it out.
Yeah, usually we do them side by side in a real room. So anyway, today we have Zinnia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you. Our first question dives right in. Is there anything you want to tell us about you sort of generally before you start? Of course, we'll pitch your podcast at the end of the episode.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll probably, without even thinking about it, bring it up throughout the episode. But yeah, just excited to talk about this because it's a group that people really don't know much about. I don't really know what to add for an intro.
That's okay. We'll dive right into the first question because that will set it all up. So you're an ex-Christadelphian, and I didn't know what a Christadelphian was until our good friend Sarah introduced us, and she was the guest I mentioned at the top of the episode. Can you give us a rundown about who the Christadelphians are, where they came from? Yeah, I mean, Preston even more so than me. We've kind of been doing this religious studies thing for a long time, and I didn't know about the Christadelphians at all.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not really on anyone's radar. They kind of fly under most people's awareness. Most people really haven't heard of them unless they've met a Christadelphian, but they're from the 1800s. They were founded in like the 1840s by a guy named John Thomas, who was from England but moved to America. And they were actually originally called Thomasites after him. But they kind of came about from other groups that he was preaching to. He would travel between different groups with a lot of people that are like Millerites and Campbellites, and people would just kind of be drawn to him. He was a really good speaker, and legend has it with the Christadelphians that he nearly died in a shipwreck. And after that, he decided to start learning about the Bible, and that's when he kind of started reading widely and talking and networking, and kind of fell into supposedly creating this religion. And they would describe it as rediscovering the truth. And so they use that term as well to describe the group. So you'll see that in their writings as well. And then it kind of, when he was getting older, he found a guy to take over for him named Robert Roberts. And then from there, he kind of was the organizer who set up the system that they use, how they're organized today. He created their first magazine that they use that still runs today called the Christadelphian, based out of England, still in Birmingham. And so that's kind of where they came from. It's really those two guys who created it, and it was really in America and England originally. But today they'd probably just describe themselves as like a small religious community that's based on the Bible and a return to first century Christianity, which you guys have probably heard before in other religions. Not exactly original once you actually start learning about religions, but that's how they would describe it. Me personally, having been in it and then having decided to learn more about their history after leaving, I would describe it more as a Victorian doomsday cult. Because it really is, their main focus is waiting for Jesus to return to the earth, where he's gonna, start wars and have all this mayhem on, kind of befall all of us. And the end times happen, and then God returns to the earth, and there's this happy reunion that they call the kingdom, and Jesus rules this kingdom. And so that's really what they're waiting for, is kind of this apocalypse. So it's a very interesting thing to see where they came from, and that's kind of who they are now.
There was a lot happening in this time of the world, in the world of religion. I kind of made a note that this is when Mormonism started as well.
Yes. He was fighting Mormons, and they would have like debates. Yeah, absolutely. Also, spiritualism came about during this time. The whole Millerite Great Disappointment. So the whole kind of in the greater cultural awareness, there was a lot of people talking about doomsday and what date Christ was going to return to.
Yeah.
But they're still waiting.
Great era for restorationist movements.
Yes.
We're going to bring back the
revivalism.
original church. People were unsatisfied with Catholicism. They were unsatisfied with the mainstream Protestantism. Yeah, it got to be a weird time.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what you see in all their old writings.
So interestingly, we're somewhere around 50,000 members today within Christadelphianism.
That's what they estimate, but there's, as far as I know, have never been like an official census.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's probably not one you get to check off when they come around to your house.
They're always so small they fall through the cracks, and they are worldwide. So probably the biggest ones that most people think of are America, kind of Europe around England, Scotland area, and then Australia actually. But more and more they've done more preaching where there's a growing group in Africa, and they're all small groups and pockets all over the world and in Canada as well.
Is it evangelical? How did it grow from those first couple people?
I mean, it started with him putting boots on the ground. He was traveling a ton. He would go from church to church to church, causing mayhem, incidentally. There's writings that say, like, without John Thomas, the restorationists would have conquered the South. So he was seen as, depending on which side you were on, as either like this incredibly intelligent, wonderful guy, or as a troublemaker. But he was always traveling, and then he would ask people to sign up for his magazine, and he even got Alexander Campbell of the Campbellites to advertise his magazine, so he's getting all these subscribers, and he was just writing and sending out his magazine to all of his contacts, growing his audience and listeners. So he was really networking, doing that kind of thing. So that was when they got a lot of growth initially. And then he got Roberts to set up his magazine. And so again, tapping into that written spread and continuing to try to find places where he could preach. And I think, let me just check my notes real quick, make sure I don't miss anything. I think that was really the period that they had the most growth, was in the 1800s, when it was all kind of that beginning art where people were like, oh, we heard this exciting new guy speaking, he has these new ideas, he's figured out the original Christianity, just this one guy, not a red flag or anything. And I think with that culture, there was a lot of excitement, because these classes that they were giving in their churches, they were being advertised in mainstream newspapers, and the newspapermen were coming and attending and writing about them. But I think there was definitely a turning point, because like after they had all these failed prophecies, because they were really doing that Millerite thing of being like, oh yeah, Jesus is going to return in like 1866 or whatever the year was, I forget off the top of my head. But then like one of the newspapermen was like, yeah, I remember when you said they were going to come back, and he didn't. And like they kind of start getting roasted. And so they were around long enough that people were starting to notice that their prophecies hadn't come true. I think they started, at different times, they were starting to get kind of a bad reputation. I think they got a little quieter, and they weren't very aggressive like a lot of other groups with marketing after that. So I think having to like edit your books, which they did to like get rid of stuff that they were wrong about, probably wasn't great. And then they just never got a ton of growth after that, because in the old stuff you see tons of baptisms, you see tons of people signing up for stuff, but then it kind of lagged.
I'm just curious, do they still do the whole doomsday thing, or are they just vague that Jesus will come back one day, or do they have a date in mind coming up?
It depends on the person. So There's a few people, I won't name names, but anyone who's an ex-Christadelphian or Christadelphian listening would be able to think of probably a couple people who have a reputation for having like a new date every couple of years. And growing up, we heard probably dozens of dates. I'm in a Facebook group for ex-Christadelphians, and so one time I asked, I was like, oh, like what are the dates that you remember? And there was dozens of comments of all these different dates going back, the last like 60, 70 years, because you have people from all different generations in there. And it was so funny to see, because they would just make up a new one every time the last one didn't come true. So yeah, they're still very much doing that, and they've been doing that for over 100 years now.
It's nice to have something to look forward to.
Yeah, there's supposed to be one, I think, next August. So I'm looking forward to that one coming.
Ooh.
Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah, August 2026, I believe, came up in a Christadelphian group that I came across. Somehow they did the Bible Mass, and that's what it said. So I'm like, all right, I'm waiting, you guys. Prove me wrong. You
Bible
got a
Mass.
chance.
Bible math is tricky business, and it's almost always based on the most ridiculously arbitrary things.
Yeah, I think this was based on the earthquakes in northeastern United States. And he's like, well, because of these earthquakes, it means in 2 years we're gonna have the return of Christ. It's like, sure.
We've got natural disasters all the time.
No, Northeast America is very important. Yeah.
For the Bible history, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
It
mostly-
features prominently.
Yeah, exactly, Katie.
What was it like to be part of this ecclesia?
So for 1 second, I just want to talk about the word ecclesia, because they really love it. And what I realized when I learned about the group was that just the founder was obsessed with Greek. And so this is just a fun fact for everyone. All of his book titles had Greek names. He gave his daughter a Greek name, Eusebius. The word Christadelphian, the name, comes from 2 Greek words he combined. So ecclesia is just the Greek word that he pulled out of the Bible that was basically church, before church was a real term. And so that's what they use, because again, they're trying to say we're really Bible-based. And it started with the founder and how he would just like dig through the Bible for these little things. And so it's really just a small church. It's probably fairly similar to a lot of other churches in the sense that they do a memorial service with bread and wine, and they do a talk. They call it an exhortation, again, going back to that biblical language. And then lots of prayers, Victorian era hymns that have been rewritten from the original that they stole from other religions, because it has to be doctrinally pure. So anything that doesn't match their doctrines had to be edited. The men read the Bible out loud at certain times. And then that's kind of the main situation for the Sundays. And then you would also go to the ecclesia for weekly Bible classes. Most of them do something during the week. Often, like once a year, maybe an ecclesia will host an event where people are invited from all the other ecclesias in the region, or really anywhere if you want to go. And they'll have a speaker, and they'll pay to fly in someone from somewhere around the world to give talks all day on Saturday and then give the exhortation on Sunday. So that's kind of what's happening at the ecclesia. But another thing to just be aware of for like the culture of it is you identify as a member of that ecclesia. So the one I was in was called Morristown, because it's usually just whatever town it's in at that time. And so we would meet at the Morristown ecclesia. And when I would travel, they would announce at the podium like, oh, Sister Zinnia is visiting us from the Morristown ecclesia. So on any given Sunday, we'd go, oh, you ready for meeting? Let's go to meeting. So the term you actually use day to day was just meeting, for going there and all the services and things like that. But it was kind of more like an identifier, like, oh, I'm American. Oh, yeah, I go to the Morristown ecclesia. That's my identity. So it's funny, that's more so an identity than even like the building or anything.
When you were describing that, you mentioned men read from the Bible, and I remember Sarah telling me, I don't know if she ever mentioned it to Preston, but there is a huge gender gap in
Absolutely.
Christadelphianism. I don't think it's one of our questions, but could you touch on that? I feel like even the women had to dress a very specific way. Tell me more.
Yeah, absolutely. So the roles are definitely very different with the men and the women. As you can tell, because I've already said Victorian era a few times, we're going back to the old school patriarchy. So the women, you can help with teaching the kids, you can help prepare food, you can help clean, and you can like prepare the bread and wine and like set it up. That's pretty much all you're going to do at the ecclesia. You have very limited opportunities to do anything that would stimulate your brain, really. You know, those women just sit down and embroider, you know. But with the men, there's a lot of pressure for them to do a lot of volunteer work. So it's actually a lot that they take on over time, because they do run all of the services. There's a number of different roles that they sign up for. each ecclesia might have a slightly different way of going about setting that up, but usually there's some sort of rotation system, and they all get slotted in at the beginning of the year. So they figure out who's on the list and then rotate through who's giving the talk. So you have to write your own talk based on your own like Bible research that you're going to do public speaking in front of everybody, which again, not everyone's comfortable with, but that's what you got to do. They're, speaking out loud. They're coming up with prayers on the spot. They're traveling to help with, leading services and doing exhortations at other ecclesias. There's a lot of pressure on them to do a lot of stuff, and they're in charge of usually like the Sunday school and managing all the programming and getting the teachers. There's someone in charge of the meeting who's kind of like a figurehead, and so that person is called the recording brother, and they handle all the correspondence with other meetings and handling a lot of business. There's also an elected board called the arranging brothers, and so those men have meetings that they have to attend and write minutes for, and who's the secretary of the board. And so you have all of the managing of it and all of the scenes, all of the activities where people are seen, where they're heard, where they're making things happen, all fall to the men. And that can be hard on young ecclesias and small ecclesias, because you have some ecclesias that have 2 brothers. So all of that falls to them. So like our church would send volunteers to these other small ecclesias just to keep them running and not have it all fall on those people. So we'd send someone to speak at their ecclesia almost every week. Yeah.
I mean, part of me is like, I'm glad men are doing some work and it's not just all like on the women, but too bad women don't have any opportunity to do anything either.
Like, I thought it was funny because I grew up in a family with both boys and girls, and my brother had no interest in like the reading. He was like a very hands-on kind of guy. He wasn't into public speaking. Meanwhile, I actually loved public speaking, and I loved reading and like synthesizing information. But even though we both had skill sets that would have lent each other to the ecclesia they could have used, because of our gender, we had to do what wasn't in our wheelhouse. I was not interested in teaching the kids. I was not interested in doing all that other stuff. And then he had to like conform himself to fit in with that. I'm like, okay, I have to learn how to be a public speaker now, and I have to sit down and read when that's really not what I want to be doing naturally.
Have you ever seen somebody join the ecclesia as an outsider?
Very rarely, and usually because it's a means to an end. Most of the conversions I saw were because their partner was a Christadelphian. I would say that's the most common. And so usually, like, I was seeing like adults join. One person, it was their second relationship, and it was very controversial when they started attending because they had had a divorce before. And so there's so many conversations had about like, is it okay if he joins? And if he marries one of our sisters who hadn't been married before, so like she's okay, but yeah, he was willing to do everything it took. So one thing that I should start with is that in order to join, you have to be baptized, and in order to be baptized, you have to take an exam. So before you can take the exam, you have to do like study sessions. So a lot of this ends up being that the brothers, again, someone has to volunteer to teach like 101 classes to the newbie who wants to join, because most people start learning from being a baby. I went every Sunday my entire life. As soon as I was born, you were at meeting. But for these people who come in as adults, they don't have the years of indoctrination and education in this religion. So they have to start somewhere. So usually it's like one night a week they're sitting around talking about this, learning it, as well as attending. So the exam's not that bad. I think I was 12 when I passed. So they want you to pass. And as long as you've got all the core beliefs down and you can talk about it, you're okay. It's not multiple choice or anything. It's kind of an oral exam, and they'll chat with you. So they just want to make sure you understand things. You know what you're getting into. You're on the same page. You're keeping those doctrines pure. You're all good. And so that's kind of the thing. And you can do it at any age. So I've seen people join who were in their 60s, who lived locally and had started attending. And so they joined. More so I saw when it came to conversions, it would be middle-aged adults, the people who were having, marriages where they had met someone who was a Christadelphian who had stayed on marriage for a bit longer and hadn't married when they were young. But one other thing that was just interesting about the baptisms is that it could be at any age. So it was really whenever you wanted to pass the exam. So mine was on the younger side of being 12, but some of my siblings, it wasn't until they're in their 20s or late teens. Some people never took the exam and just never joined. And then again, you have people who join later in life. And so you have people all ages. And I just thought that was funny for talking about with you guys who have so much religious history knowledge and know about all these different groups. Because thinking about it, like you have bar mitzvahs where it's all kind of at the same age. You've got, I remember growing up with kids and like, oh, we're all going to CCD. And it was all like the same time. And then they all stopped going to CCD at the same time. And so I was like, okay, it seems like it's just these certain like time frames that other religions have. But with this, it's really open-ended. So whenever you want to join, you can join. As long as you know the doctrines, you're good. The other funny thing is that if you marry outside the group, so if basically you're dating someone and they don't decide to take the exams, they take the one-on-one classes, they're like, I'm open-minded, I'll give it a try, and they go, hey, it's not for me, I still think you're a great person, let's keep this going, but I don't want to join your religion, that could be a problem. Like I knew someone who had dated someone for over a decade, and after that, that person started attending every week. They were a wonderful person. And by that point now attending a couple of years every week with their partner, super supportive. They finally got married. Again, this is probably 15 years into their relationship of being, committed monogamous relationship. And he was punished because she was not baptized at the time that they got married and she did not join. And so I think he was stripped of his duties was what I heard. Like he was a bad representative to go up to the front. There are other people I've heard of. One person married someone who was not a baptized member, and the day of their wedding, they got a letter slipped through the door that he was no longer a member. So it can be pretty severe consequences if you don't go through this process of being baptized. It does change your status there. And for the women, Katie, the women now have to wear head coverings. So it can be a hat, it can be like cloth, it can be all sorts of different things, knitted, crocheted. As long as you're covered, people will put napkins on their head if necessary in order to be covered and meet the criteria if they're at a church that requires it. Like I said, there's splits. So one of the splits was because do women have to wear hats? So there's depending on which individual church you go to, as the ecclesia, you might be okay. But generally that's another like visible difference between the sexes as well.
Interesting. And so if you kind of said, some people, in your family chose to do it later. And then you said some people never choose to do it. So would there be people who would go their entire, but still go to meeting every week and just like never choose to get baptized? Or is there an age where
there's an age where you
would be like,
yeah, you get dirty looks, you get peer pressure. The peer pressure starts when you're an adolescent, like middle school age. That's when they start shipping you off to the events hosted on the weekends a lot. They just call them weekends. And so that's when you are in a lot of classes and mixers. You're kind of encouraged to start dating other Christadelphians. Pardon. Someone walked by and I got distracted. But yeah, so like I had one cousin who never got baptized and went away for college and just never appeared again. And so there are people that just disappear because I think part of it is if you're around it, you're always going to be around that peer pressure, and you're going to have people like brothers will come up to you and ask you to explain yourself. They'll be like, oh, when are you getting baptized? And things like that. It's kind of like, oh, always the bridesmaid, never the bridegroom. Like people will come up to you and be like, oh, when's your turn? Huh? There's a lot of pressure on young people. And at the events that they go to, I remember people at the podium would be preaching to you guys and be like, well, if Jesus came today, I don't know if you'd be saved, because the doctrine says if you have the knowledge but you didn't act on it, basically you're bad, you're not getting in. And if you had the knowledge and didn't get baptized, like you might be shit out of luck. And so they make it very important that you make that decision. If you know enough to pass the exam, you should be taking the baptism exam and becoming a member. And so, like, they'll make it life or death. Be like, yeah, like, if you want to survive the apocalypse when Jesus comes back, you really gotta take that exam. So they definitely bring it up. It's not something you can easily get out of. But a lot of people, in order to get out of it, they literally move away, run away. They just disappear. Like, you never hear why they leave historically. You may not see them again. You may never know why they didn't do it. But usually it's a sign that they will be leaving at some point.
I mean, I don't blame you, Zinnia. I feel like I'm enough of a keener child. I'd be like, I'm going to be the first one baptized in my age group.
Yeah, I was 12.
Yeah.
That would have been me and you together.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have. Yeah, let's get it out of the way so people leave me alone.
Yeah, between not feeling the guilt about it or the shame or just the fear, like there's a lot of emotional upheaval. It's like, I guess I have to do this. And you're young, you want to make your parents happy. All these adults in your life, like all the significant adults in your life, like a lot of extended families are there. So I would see all of my aunts and uncles. I would see, you know, all of my family. My grandma was there. And they all be like, yes, and you're like, you got to do this. Okay.
We've touched on it a few times, so I think this is a good segue into the doctrine.
Okay.
Because some of it is kind of weird. At least weird. Well, I think
Relative to the mainstream.
Well, I was going to say I'm the atheist of the group. I think all doctrines are weird.
Fair enough.
But yes, relative to the mainstream, there's some things that are quite separate from regular, air quotes, Christianity.
Which I have to try to figure out because I'm just like, oh, for me,
you know.
all I know.
The big one I knew from Sarah is the Trinity, that Jesus and God are not the same.
Yeah, we are anti-Trinity. They're, like Preston mentioned about the Restoration, they're not into anything Catholic. They hate the Catholics and their doctrine. So they're very proud of not believing in the Trinity. I also remember, like, mainstream Christianity was presented as dangerous. We were not allowed to watch VeggieTales, no Christian music, no crosses. That was bad. That was how you knew those sinners and not the people with the truth. So that's why, like, for me, like, I don't even know. I wasn't even allowed to know what it was. So I was trying to think more about it. And I think Katie will enjoy this because I was trying to think about it. And I was like, well, the big thing is their doctrines would fall apart with the Trinity because Jesus has to be very, very special. What they kind of say is that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. He was a blood sacrifice. And by, you know, atonement or whatever, I've been out of this group for a decade. They basically wash the sins of all of humanity away. And so, you know, this God loves blood sacrifices. They went from killing animals to killing, you know, Jesus, and that made God happy. And that is what allowed the Christadelphians kind of to exist, because they're like, well, that allows somehow it's like this allows the Gentiles to be God's people too, and not just the Jews because of Jesus. And so they're like, well, now through Christ's blood, we have access to the promises of Abraham to inherit the land when Jesus returns in the kingdom. And Jesus has this role of establishing this kingdom, remember? So he's going to come back. He's the one doing all the action, leading the wars, because Christadelphians will become members of his army. They'll be raised from the dead. So the zombie Christadelphians will also be there fighting for Jesus. It's a great time. They're really excited for that day. I don't know if it's swords or what, but they're going to be out there getting stuff done. And so that doesn't really work if God and Jesus are the same. Like, and even growing up, it made sense to me because, like, you look around and, like, Preston, I assume you have a dad and you're a son. Like, that is a model that I've seen of just biological nature. They're usually not the same. That'd be very unusual. I don't know how that would work. So it kind of just takes that scientific basis and then it adds this, props up the doctrine on top. It's like, yes, it's important that he's the son. He's doing God's bidding. He had to go through this. I feel like it was almost taught like, oh, it would be a cop-out if he was God. Like, just showed up, hangs out for a little bit, dies, and go back to be God again. So there was like this whole thing. And so they're really obsessed with Jesus. That's why they're doing shots of Jesus blood up there. And all of the exhortations really end in like, and that's why we've gathered here together, everyone, to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And that's pretty much how every exhortation ends. And so it's all about Jesus. And then the Holy Spirit doesn't come up very much, but it's more like, oh, that's God's power. And what's really funny is when I was reading old Christadelphian writings, they used to believe that God's power was electricity. When electricity was new in the 1800s. And so I was like, I guess the Holy Spirit is just electricity. But they kind of let that one fade away. They just don't talk about that one anymore. That's not a real doctrine. That was just something they were like toying with when they're like, ooh, electricity, that seems like that might fit the ticket here.
That's a pretty common analogy used by Jehovah's Witnesses, though, that
Really?
spirit is like electricity.
Are you kidding? They took that and kept it? That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because I find it so funny.
I mean, I was going to say, I feel like Thor and Zeus cornered that market
Oh,
way
yeah.
before.
Yeah.
But all right.
Yeah. But that makes sense since they do have overlapping bits of doctrine with a lot of other groups. And that is for the exact reason you would think. It's borrowed from other groups.
It's easier that way. If you hear something you like, you go, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. It must be true. But can we improve on it just a little bit, maybe?
And just like cross out the name at the bottom of who it's attributed to. Even better.
Lots of it.
Yeah. It was my idea. I figured it out. I'm so smart.
Sorry.
No, you're
Did
good.
you have more? One belief I found really different is that you don't believe in any sort of afterlife.
Me personally, different. Christadelphians? Yes.
Yes. Sorry. You as the Christadelphians.
I know.
Christadelphians.
I was worried I was going to accidentally be like, us, the Christadelphians, during this interview, and I was like, make sure you do not.
Christadelphians don't believe in afterlife.
Yeah, what's funny is originally they were called no soulists, and that was how they were like critiqued in early writings and kind of delineated from a lot of the other people in the Restoration movement. So yeah, that's another core belief, is there is no soul, there's no heaven, no hell. So none of those main ideas, which are very common in other groups. So you are just your physical body. That's all you get. That's the idea. And so the after death is just you decompose. That is the belief. And again, kind of like what I'd said before, it felt very scientific. It felt very natural. It's like, yeah, you can see decomposition. You've seen animals on the side of the road and, they crumble until it's just bones there. And you're like, okay, that makes sense that that's what happens. And so it's not all bleak, though, because they do believe in the apocalypse. And I may have joked around saying zombies, but it's really they believe that Jesus has the power, God has the power to restore you to your physical self as you are now. So with all of your mental capabilities, with all of your emotional stuff, I guess, and your memories, it's not super specific in the Bible, but there's apparently enough that they believe that you will just be back as you were magically. And it's whenever Jesus returns. They're very excited for that day. That would kind of be when the judgment is. And again, I think there was another split about how that process goes when Jesus returns, if he raises everybody and then it's like, naughty list, you're dead again. Naughty list, you're dead again. And just like has to like kill everyone again that didn't make it. Or if he just raises his like saints and is like, okay, all of you guys this way to Jerusalem, grab your sword. And then you're off gallivanting into the sunset to do mayhem. But they basically say that death is like sleeping. And so I recently had an extended family member die, and I got a text message saying, Aunt so-and-so fell asleep in the Lord. And so fell asleep in the Lord is their term for saying that that person is now essentially sleeping until Jesus returns. And so that's the hope they have, instead of like going to heaven right away or going to hell if you've been naughty. It's really, you hope that you will get resurrected. And so it's a long-term plan, but essentially it's like going to sleep and waking up, they say. So it feels like you're only, asleep for a minute, like you went under anesthesia and then you woke back up again. So it's not seen as a really bad thing even to like die, because you're like, oh, the sooner I get to see Jesus. Oof. Like Robert Roberts in some of his writings is like, oh, I am ready to see Jesus. And you're like, no, Roberts, I think you're talking about suicide. Like, don't feel that way. You can make it. So this is like, oh, ready to see Jesus. What is funny, I have more notes. I was just noticing that Jesus was supposed to return in like the 1860s. Like I had mentioned before, they had all these prophecies of his return. And one thing I kept finding was that every generation was told this was going to happen during their lifetime. And they're all like, oh, great, he's going to come back any day. And I'm now I was in the 5th generation, I believe. And I now have a 6th generation of my family growing up in this. So I do not believe that is what's happening. I do not believe it is coming soon. A lot of people have fell asleep in the Lord. And it was supposed to be that was how they got all their believers. They're like, it's happening now. Like, they're putting in the newspapers, like, Jesus is coming any day. We're all going to be resurrected and swept away. And it didn't happen. And I think even to go back to what I talked about before is I think it feels scientific because I'm like, okay, we've learned a lot to see that there's not really a hell. There's magma and stuff. It is hot, but we've never found like a society of people slaving away down there. And then like we've sent rockets to outer space and like, where is heaven? Like, is it in our stratosphere or is it in the Milky Way? Like, where is it? Like, you keep going up and you just can't ever find it. So I think for me, it was reassuring to know that that wasn't really there. It did make me question where God was then. I was like, if we're not going to heaven, where is he in heaven right now? Because I can't figure out where that is. And I think the only good part about this teaching for me was I wasn't afraid of hell, which a lot of people, it sounds like, struggle with when they've left religion. So I was just more confused about heaven, but there was no devil trauma. There was no hell trauma. So that was good, honestly. Like, of all the teachings, that one felt more innocent to me. I was like, oh, I'm just going to die. That's fine. And they're like, well, if you leave, you're never going to get resurrected. I'm like, you know what? That's fine. That's fine. I'm good. One go around for me.
Yeah, it's kind of a nice alternative to the very traumatic things that we tell a lot of people in a lot of other faiths. And the Christadelphians share this in common with Jehovah's Witnesses, that there's, when you die, that's it. Except maybe if you're really good and Jesus wants to keep you around, then you can come back. So there's nothing to worry about. If there's no power of fear for sin really in the long term, though being shunned from your community can really suck.
Yeah, and there's always the fear of not being good enough. Because like, oh, I took the exam, but then they're like, yeah, but have you sinned this week? You got to come back to meeting and repent. And so it's always like you're on a hamster wheel. So.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and I know the Jehovah's Witnesses have a set number of people that are allowed to come back. And, you know, part of me is like, they've been around for 5 or 6 generations as well. Eventually, you're going to have more Jehovah's Witnesses than what Jesus is going to let come back.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. They've surpassed the 144,000 members.
Yeah. That was the number I was thinking of from Revelation. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, but I guess 5 generations of 50,000 Christadelphians, you'd surpass that number. I don't know if you guys, the Christadelphians, pardon me, have a number. But yeah, like,
it's a problem no one talks about.
You could be the best of the best. You gotta be top tier Christadelphia, because even the bottom tier ones might not get resurrected anymore.
But I feel like then it's only the brothers, so they'll be like, well, look at all this work you put in. And they're like, oh, we did too. And they're like, yeah, but you didn't give as many exhortations. Like, oh, man.
Or of course, you're a woman. Sorry.
There's that too. Just, well, as you can see from reading the Bible, I generally only like men.
So heaven's a sausage party.
I was gonna say that sounds pretty gay, God.
I think John Thomas would have the best time though. He hated women, so be like, yeah, this God figured it out.
What culturally separates Christadelphians from everybody else around them?
The one thing is the strict attendance requirements. They actually will track everyone's attendance, which I don't know if a lot of other groups do that or not. But even the ecclesial guide that Robert Roberts made says it's unlawful not to attend the weekly meeting. And in some ecclesias, they will kick you out, which is called disfellowshipping, where they basically withdraw the fellowship. You're not allowed to take the bread and wine. You're no longer like an official member with baptized standing if you have poor attendance. So that's one, is you better get your butt in the seat. So it's every Sunday minimum. So some people skimp in late and skip the Sunday school, and so they get the side eye. And then there's also like the mid-weekly event where you've got the Bible classes. So you're supposed to be at that. And in some regions, so I've heard that it's more so kind of in England where they have a strong group of Christadelphians. There's a lot of different ecclesias. They have tons of volunteers for things. From what I've heard, there can be an expectation to be there every day of the week. Really, because each different meeting can host a Bible class on a different night of the week. So you got your whole week covered. There's all your extracurriculars. So depending where you are, if you're at a small ecclesia, it might not be as much something that impacts you, but just being busy. And especially for me, I remember just being an adolescent in a team, you were shipped off all weekend, every weekend. We'd be driving out to Ohio. We would drive up to Canada. We would take a 12-hour drive on a Friday night just to get there for the weekend and leave Sunday after the memorial service. It was very intense. We burned a lot of rubber. But the other thing, I guess, visually, we talked about the head coverings that you wear. One of the cultural things with a society is that, it especially comes up in Australia, is they're not allowed to vote. So places that have mandatory voting, it becomes a bigger conflict. They also can't serve on a jury. They can't serve in the military. So you do have to kind of give up some of your civil rights, which is an interesting stance. And some people have been disfellowshipped if they were found out to have voted in an election. That can be another big sticking point. You are not supposed to do that, which again shows the influence and some control in your life outside of the church. Again, that's, you know, your place in society. I also think that just the idea of being God's chosen one is probably not the healthiest view to take with you day to day around the world. So I have found that can be an issue, especially with, like, you're supposed to only date within the Christadelphians and things like that. So it comes up a lot where people might get lonely, or they might not have a lot of close relationships with people outside of the meeting. So that's just kind of, it affects your socializing a lot. You also might get isolated, you know, because you might only really know some Christadelphians. The only other one I saw was traveling is absolutely huge. So because all the young people are pushed to go on these weekends and travel, and then there's tons of long distance relationships and a lot of people moving within the group. So I have cousins who married people in Australia and Texas, Canada, Ohio, traveling all over, and just spending all of your free time traveling, which can be fun and can be intense. So that's just another cultural thing. It's very common to have a random relative from another country and be like, oh yeah, that's just Aunt Sarah from Hungary. She's great. But like, you're like, wait, like, why is she there in another country? But it would always be like, oh yeah, she's at that meeting there. Okay, all right. Like one summer we just had an Australian living at my cousin's house. Never met them before. It's like, oh, she just lives here now. Okay, she's a Christadelphian. So that was the only other like funny thing that would happen. One time we just had a guy from Rhode Island live at our house for the summer. I'm like, okay, he just lives here for 3 months. Sure.
I mean, I guess it's good if you can trust them.
Right.
I don't know if I'd like a random stranger in my house. Oh
Trust
no.
is a pretty nice thing to share in a community for sure. But it's not like it's never been abused either.
Yeah, just because you're any one thing doesn't mean you're a good any one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You could be a Christadelphian and be a bad person. You can be an atheist and be a bad person. You can
Agree.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's too bad there isn't one thing that you're like, oh yeah, that means this person's safe.
Right.
Alas.
They don't do an exam for that.
No, that you should.
They
Forget
should.
the baptism
It's called
exam.
fingerprinting.
How do you test for that? See our episode on morals.
Yeah. People lie about their morality all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Every narcissist.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's get into the danger cult stuff because I liked how I worded the question. Some people call it a quiet little Christian denomination, and other people, the ex-Christadelphians I know, say it's a danger cult. What's your take? Obviously, as an ex-Christadelphian, you have some experience there, and I know you've also talked to a lot of ex-Christadelphians. So
Yeah. So it'll take a minute to talk about because I do always want to add some nuance to it. So I've kind of, I believe, already referred to it as a cult. I think there's a lot of attributes of it that would make it broadly fit most definitions of a cult when you really look at it and are familiar with it. And it has the classic problem where anyone who's in it says, oh no, we're not a cult. And somehow everyone who leaves pretty much unanimously says, oh, they're a cult. So that's one good way to test whether it is likely a cult. So I agree they absolutely want people to see them that way. And I think anyone who doesn't know about them that deeply would see that. Generally, you know, they just quietly walk into meeting with their little Bible bags and they sing their hymns with their piano and then they walk out and they're done for the day. They don't really cause much of a stir like they used to. Like they literally used to like stand and scream from like podiums and common areas and be like, come to our meeting, the end times are here. So now, like, they're really small. They're very quiet. But I think the biggest problem, and that's kind of been a theme for them throughout this, is that every ecclesia is so unique. So you can have an ecclesia and have honestly the nicest people with amazing cooks, and they're super friendly and warm, and you have a great time. There are a lot of kids who say, I had a wonderful childhood at Christadelphian. I saw my grandma every week, and I got hugs from my aunties and uncles, and I felt I had so much stability because I always knew every Sunday we were going to meeting, and it was good. So there are some people that say that. Great. Whether or not it's cult, no stuff, but is it dangerous? So meanwhile, I know one woman who I've spoken to personally who grew up in a meeting where her dad was a pedophile, her uncle murdered someone, and someone in her meeting was a serial killer. So you've got a full spectrum there of people that have had wonderful, idyllic childhoods and experiences and have best friends that they met there that they still have today. And then you have people who are still in therapy. There's a broad spectrum there. That's why you might meet some wonderful people. I don't want to have anyone think that all ex-Christadelphians are bad or anything like that. I still personally have family in the group and family that I love too. I do think digging in a little deeper that the belief system itself can be toxic and pretty traumatizing. So I think, pretty much everyone I've talked to has recommended therapy when they left, or has said they have done therapy or they're looking to do therapy. There's a lot. I mean, I think for even looking at the kids, you're being told you might get left behind if you're not baptized. So what if, I thought Jesus was coming when I'm 11 and I'm having nightmares every night because I'm scared that I haven't passed the exam yet. That's a trauma on a kid. And then if you're saved, on the other hand, so now I'm 12, I got baptized. Well, now if Jesus comes back, I have to pick up my sword and commit murder against the heathens. So that's also traumatizing, being like, well, I don't want to do that. I'm a good girl just trying to get an A in school. I don't want to be swept away to Israel because the belief is it's all set up in Jerusalem. It's very Israel-centric. So I don't want to leave my home. I've only ever, at that point, only ever lived in the United States. And so like some of these ideas about what's going to go on can be very scary. And even the patriarchal aspects of it, I think, tends to groom women for abuse and abusive relationships, especially. It can groom men to be more abusive than they may have been, to expect this kind of dominion and control over women and children, because when children are always taught you must be obedient to your parents, those verses are used like a weapon. And then women are always told that they must submit unto their husbands, just like, Jesus is under God. And there's very much a very strong hierarchy. And of all the verses they could pick, they always make sure those ones get mentioned a lot. You know how that goes. And so those are some of the things that I really think of. And so let's say you join your ecclesia. They're all independent, self-governing. So you don't entirely know what you're getting into. It depends on the character of the men in charge. So really that arranging brother group that was elected. So you might have some really lovely guys. A lot of the guys I remember, I always thought seemed pretty nice where I was. They were definitely, the more I hear about them and how things have played out, very patriarchal though, and very loyal to the purity of those doctrines. So even as nice as they may be, like I should have been kicked out. I instead had to write a letter being like, no, I'm out, please stop. Because they were too nice to kick me out. But they knew like I should have been, because I hadn't attended in so long, and they had my attendance records, and so I got onto their list, like we have to remind her to attend, that's our duty. And I was like, I didn't forget. And so that's why it really depends. And so it was interesting to see how once you are baptized, when you're young, you're thinking about, I just want to be saved, I just want to be good. But once you join, you've basically given your consent to have whatever arranging brothers are there in charge of your life now. And so women basically become property, especially once you get married to a baptized brother, he's now in charge of you. And so a lot of times, like when you have these men in charge handling domestic abuse, let's say, do you think they're giving a lot of power to the women? no, you need to submit to your husband and not make him mad. When women want to get a divorce, oh, well, in the Bible it says that you are one. You know, you need to be equally yoked to each other. So because he's baptized, you have to stick with him. Sorry. And so you get a lot of men forcing women to be in unsafe situations, and not really looking out for people's well-being so much as, what does the Bible say? You know, the Bible's perfect. So if the Bible says that this is what we have to do, this is what we have to do. And Mr. Sexist Paul has a lot to say about it. So women need to shut up. He's my least favorite person in the Bible, I think. And then women really suffer. You know, I saw a lot of single women, and it was just sad to hear about how many of them had unhappy marriages. And it just seemed like there was no way out. And that's even come out, or I have heard of one incident where there was apparently a history of domestic abuse, and it ended up with, because she couldn't, I guess, get divorced, or for whatever reason they did not, I would suspect it's because it's against their doctrines, it ended in murder. So that's, you know, something that people forget, is that historically, when there's no divorce, there is a correlation with husbands dying a little young. And so, you know, it's just, I'm going off on a couple tangents, but there's a lot of negative aspects that can absolutely come out in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong people in charge, leaning too hard on the purity of their doctrines and not having empathy and not having flexibility and not really caring for their flocks how I think Jesus would have wanted them to be quite honest with you, from how his character is presented in the Bible. Yeah, it totally depends, but I really don't want men with Victorian era values in charge of my life. I've seen how that has played out. I've seen them tell a woman who was separated she had to go back to her husband. She was not permitted to have a divorce. A grown woman, probably older than some of the men on this board, being like, well, the brothers say I can't do it. I'm like, oh my God. Like, and you're just in this little bubble. And it's like, no, you are legally, like a grown adult. You can legally do that, but you voluntarily give up your rights. That's the thing, is you are taught that that is something that you have to do because these men are basically representatives of God, and God doesn't want you to do that because his writings, interpreted by these guys, is said to not allow it. Right. So that's the first part. If you guys want to say anything, I feel like it's just going to be me ranting if you don't pop in every once in a while to comment.
I did have a question, and maybe this is going to come up, but one of my favorite definitions of a cult is a group you're scared to leave. So what are some of the repercussions, you know, if that lady did end up hiring a lawyer and divorcing her husband anyway?
Definitely would get kicked out.
Yeah.
And like for the person I'm thinking of, they had children still in there who had married and had grandchildren there. So now you're basically, anytime you would go to visit any of your siblings, anytime you go to the meeting you grew up in with all of your friends and family, you would be basically shamed. And so you can go, but I don't know of many people who were disfellowshipped and still choose to go and deal with the stigma and the shame around it. I've heard of some people who are told that they need to like repent and like publicly apologize or like write a letter and stuff and like acknowledge your sins in order to come back. Ooh, it's very dark. But yeah, people really, if you leave, you run, usually. There's no time where you leave. Like people have joked like, oh, like what about the Amish? Do you guys get like a year to like pick like if you're gonna stay or not? I'm like, no, we don't have any like time frame where you have that flexibility. You're supposed to choose when you're young. Like most people join before they're 18 while they're still minors. And then there is no script for leaving. There is no path to leaving. The people I saw leave just disappeared. You never knew if they left or not. Because I'm like, oh, well, you know, they went away for a bit. They moved away. Maybe they're attending another meeting. Maybe they're not. You don't really know unless you never see them come back. But it really depends. So a lot of people just slip out, just stop attending as much, fade away. And those sometimes would get caught and someone be like, hey, you haven't been attending as much. There's people who would fade away. Like I knew people who would just start reading other books or like doodling and write and like totally zonking out and like not paying attention at all, but they were still physically attending. But then eventually they're like, yeah, I can't do this. Very rarely is there a very open, honest communication about a lot of stuff, but there can be people chasing you down. I got letters and emails and cards and all kinds of stuff telling me to keep going. Like I was not supposed to leave. But at that point, I hadn't attended in a couple of years. But once I moved away and they didn't have like tabs on me, because I had still lived with family. And so people would see me and like know what I was up to. And people would pop in all the time. Tons of Christadelphians were in the house all the time. So once I was gone and they didn't have like any influence over me and they didn't have any eyes on me, like literally I started seeing people like watching like my stories and stuff on social media who would never talk to me or like anything. They were just like watching me online even. I was like, oh no, this is not right. So usually you choose to cut the cord at the end because the behavior is so weird or how you're treated gets so bad. You know, there's a number of different ways it can play out as you go through leaving, however that looks like, whether you're kicked out or you choose to leave. But it's usually very awkward. And usually just a lot of weird actions happening, but not a lot of people talking about anything. So some of the things that I was thinking of that I might mention while we're talking about dangerous cult, which I'm sure you're going to love, Katie. You look very excited. One that absolutely blew my mind because it was not in the area I was in. As far as I know, it hasn't really been in the United States and Canada, but I hear about it mostly out of Australia. Don't know if it's spread out of there, but underwear inspections. Yeah, red flag right away. So what I have heard about it, again, secondhand, was that boys were told that they not only need purity of doctrine, but also pure white underwear. And they would get in trouble if they had any colored underwear on. And so they would do these inspections to check, are you staying pure? Do you have your white pantaloons on? And so, again, I feel like this is just an example of high control religion. You know, if you're not going to say it's a cult, it's at least high control if you've got that level of clothing mandatory, requirement. Because I don't think Jesus gives a shit about your underwear. You can bleep me out if you have to. But how it plays out and why I also find it concerning when whether it's political or whatever groups have concerns about kids, is that how it plays out when you're concerned about people's underwear or what's underneath their underwear is what it means that grown men could ask young boys to take their clothes off at any time. And in other contexts, sometimes they're asking young women to take their clothes off. That's not appropriate for minors, in my view. And so, unfortunately, that has infiltrated some of the Christadelphians in some regions. And so, one person I talked to directly said that they knew someone where this preceded sexual abuse, which I think we all knew was the direction this was going. And at least one boy who was abused died by suicide as a result of the trauma of being sexually abused through the Christadelphians. And so I would consider that a dangerous cult. If you're in a place that does underwear inspections and they are forcing minors to undress in order to prove if they're holy or not, you need to leave. Like, that's not safe. I don't think that's safe for your children. I'd also be concerned about how they're treating other groups that are vulnerable, but not okay. Other things that I've heard of that I would kind of consider a general concern that I didn't personally witness but have heard about would be their heritage colleges. Those are their schools. And so I have heard from some people who have attended these schools, which are around the world, tons of different countries. There have been times where in these small schools, teachers are able to be alone with students, which again, red flag. And so if an opposite sex teacher is unsupervised with a child, there would be some concerns. And from what I've heard, sometimes people have presented those concerns and they were not investigated and remediated. So I would consider those sorts of environments dangerous. So there are some of their own schools that I don't believe are following best safe practices for children all the time in every location. And like we were talking about earlier with the people traveling, you may go to the best ecclesia. Everyone is super safe and they're all, teachers and going into public schools where they're all tested and, kept up with all of their checks and stuff with other groups. That's great. But what happens when you send your kid to a weekend camp? Do you know all the adults there? Do you know any of the new people? What if it's a first-time attendee is there and they are not a safe person and you never even would have thought to wonder if they're there? Usually people just drop the kids and drive off. So it's whatever adults were like assigned to host that event are now in charge. So it may be that someone you've never met before in your life is now in charge of you. And that one's probably the one I relate to the most. Let's take a big breath. Ranting. Because one event I went to in Canada, sorry, my sweet Canadian friends, but I went up to Manitoulin Island where a group of Christadelphians own a property, and so they have like this camp there on a lake full of leeches. So I did not swim there. But what happened there was I just went in the showers one day and someone walked up behind the showers and started video recording me while I was naked in the showers. And I had been there a year before and nothing bad happened, nothing weird happened. I had a nice time. And so I went back second year, totally different experience. Traumatized, was feeling very ashamed, feeling very isolated, feeling very uncertain, was very young, was over 18, which was reminded to me, which is alarming, because I guess their first thought was mandatory reporting, and it turns out they chose not to report, but I was given the impression that the adults, so again, I didn't really know, there are all these Canadians and people who live by the border if they were Americans, not anyone that I would have grown up with being 13 hours at least from home for me. And they were in charge and they wouldn't even like follow up with me. And so I ended up following up with them and they're like, oh yeah, no, we actually didn't figure out who it was or anything, but we put some wood there to prevent it from happening again. So we're all good here, right? I was like, no, I want to know who it was and what happened to the footage. And I'm really traumatized. So you did nothing about that. She's like, oh, you should talk to someone. You want to talk to me? And I was like, the person who didn't help me. No, I don't actually want to talk to you. Are you even a therapist? No, didn't think so. So I found that very troubling. And so I could see that happening to a lot of other people where you're away. For me, I was in a foreign country at the time. I had no phone access of my own. It was at a camp in the middle of the woods. So being in a different country, being in a rural area, all those kinds of things really made it impossible to take any action, to leave the situation, to really do much. And I was really at the bottom of the totem pole too, because when you look at it, it's like, oh, I was a single woman. Women are at the bottom, obviously. Being unmarried is actually lower status too. Being unbaptized is lower status. So it's these married, older, baptized adults who are in charge and running it. And I was like, okay, well, they said they're handling it, and they did not. And that's a very big regret that I have, because I was like, it's like a locked door mystery. Come on, you got a list of attendees, cross off names as you look at the phones. Like by the end of the week, you have a handful of people you investigate further. Within 2 weeks, entire thing case closed. Like I didn't feel like it'd be that hard. It's like, you got this, guys. I believe in you. It's not that hard. And I'm dealing with my trauma, so you guys handle that. Great. They did not. And from what I've heard from one person, it's possible they did a cover up instead to make the problem go away. Because I started hearing rumors later about something, and then someone else said that they firsthand witnessed that rumor playing out that I had heard. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm hearing from multiple sources that something happened where they basically pretended they found the phone was what happened. So that they would be like, oh, well, it's all solved. We figured out that. But then no one ever followed up with me. And when I asked if they found it, they said no. So it was really, whatever happened all those years ago was very shady. And then when I talked about it publicly online, at the time it was on Facebook years ago, I was contacted by one of the people who was supposed to be helping me and like handling it, one of the adults I talked to initially, and they asked me to take it down. And they said to stop talking about it. And so again, I was seeing like cover up behavior. And then that person got involved with an organization that's supposed to help prevent that from happening and help people report. So it's like, oh, that's concerning. So I have some serious concerns about that stuff. And that all came from personal experience. So for me, it's like my ecclesia had some issues. Definitely had bullying issues, harassment, people in abusive relationships and stuff. Like, you had a lot of traumatized people, but in general, your kid was probably okay. But I've heard of other people who thought that was their ecclesia, and they found out after they left that there had been abuse that had been covered up. There are people where the abuse was out in the open, and they still were at those meetings and suffering. And so it's tough because you have a culture where people are subservient and they're all working towards the goal of this kingdom, but they let people get hurt along the way. There's not a big focus on caring for people. There's not a big priority on how like young people are treated and cared for, all that kind of stuff. So I think the system's kind of broken. Like, oh, our doctrine's so great, it's so pure. I'm like, okay, well, how do you treat your kids? I'm pretty sure that's what Jesus is going to care about. Well, some of them get abused, some of them commit suicide after they're abused, some of them get video recorded in showers while they're trying to study the Bible with their friends, you know, normal stuff at the Christadelphians. Like, yeah, that's not good. That's not good. I don't think Jesus is going to be happy with that. But good luck getting into the kingdom. Keep your sword ready. So it just varies, you know.
It will forever be confusing to me that any group decides that they would rather preserve their reputation by protecting the wrongdoers instead of publicly denouncing the wrongdoers.
Yes.
One of those is going to be a lot better for your reputation.
That's why they have a hard line of silence. So if we silence everyone and none of this gets out, we'll be okay. So if I suddenly go missing, you know why.
I just would like Jesus to actually come back and lay the smack down on these people, because that's what he would actually do.
Wouldn't that be great?
Right? Like, I would love to just ask these people, like, what do you think Jesus is going to do when he comes back and hears you did nothing about this situation?
Yeah, I've only heard of one situation secondhand where they made the right choice, but I think they put it to a vote first. They're like, should we report this child abuse to the police? And they voted yes. But that could have gone either way, which I find concerning. But they're like, should we? Because it was like a family member, I believe, that was abusing someone in their household who was a minor. And I was like, yeah, if like that, 100%, that's literally mandatory reporting. Like, you have to do that. You don't vote about that. You just do it. So that's why like the bar is so low, and they still can't always clear it. So yeah, there's a lot of stories of protecting abusers and compounding harm and trauma on victims. So not everyone is really going to be a victim in all of those really dark ways, but the ones who are have really awful stories, unfortunately. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon either. It is more prevalent than people think in the Christadelphian community for there to be really significant harms.
So you've put a lot of time in the last few years into a podcast. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, pitch yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I love talking about the podcast. So it's called the Life After Leaving podcast, and it was really intended for ex-Christadelphians because there's really not a lot out there, again, being such a small group, and you've got an even smaller group of people who have left and being around the world, very isolated and disjointed. So there was a community on Facebook, and they were really incredible to me. They were the people who actually supported me in reporting crimes that I'd been a victim of, including the incident that happened at Manitoulin with the shower. And over time, I ended up getting more interested in Christadelphian history and wanted to talk about it with them. And my posts were getting buried in the Facebook group, and I wasn't great for like long form with what I wanted to do. And, you know, when you put more than one link, it only shows the one link prominently. And it was just awkward. Like, let me think about this. And I decided to make a podcast. I just felt like that would be a great way for me to ramble on about history and what I discovered. And then I thought, my story is not the only story. I want other voices, because every ecclesia, every story is so unique. So I asked people to come on and kind of do like an oral history of their time in the group. And I got a really amazing group of people that came on and kept inspiring more and more people to come on. So I've done a ton of interviews now with people from all over the world, all different ages and gender and all that kind of stuff, and background and experiences, to share their stories of what it was like being a Christadelphian, as well as try to talk about hope and healing with like, hey, here's where I'm at now. Here's what I did after I got out. because we always saw people just disappear usually, like I had mentioned before. And so now we're finishing those stories and like, yeah, we may have disappeared from you at the meeting, but we didn't just disappear. We were in therapy. We were learning to make new friends. We were learning to change identities. We were going to new churches and figuring out what we believe. You know, we'll show you the messy part. We'll talk about the messy part that you didn't get to see, that you guys didn't want to hear about because it would threaten your worldview, to know that we were asking hard questions. And these were the things we were thinking about. And these were the books we were reading that were challenging us while we were trying to deconstruct. And so we get these really cool conversations as well in the podcast. And I love digging into the history stuff. It's also been really nice meeting some really awesome people who used to be Christadelphians. So it's been nice to kind of build a stronger ex-Christadelphian community. And it's been a great way for people to find stuff on this, especially since it's like there's tons of Christadelphian podcasts. You can find an exhortation so easily. There's thousands online. But right now, I believe we're the only ex-Christadelphian podcast. So it's the only place where you can hear history that doesn't have their bias, the only place where you're really hearing these really vulnerable and really personal stories of what it was like being a Christadelphian, and what people's experiences were like. So like I said about the one woman who grew up with a pedophile for a dad and an uncle who was a murderer, came on the podcast to talk about that. So there's a lot of people who are able to find someone that they relate to, whether it's how they left or the things they experienced. And it's been really great hearing from so many people that they found it healing to listen to. So that's the main group it's for, but it's also been great for people who are just curious about cults. They're just curious about different religions. So, you know, people like you and your listeners who may be interested in learning about a weird cult, you can definitely find some crazy stories, some crazy history, and especially, you know, it's a group most people haven't heard about. So it's all fresh and fun and new for you guys to hear about. And I try to keep all the interesting stuff in there. I'll tell you when I find something cool in the archives.
Amazing. Yeah, no, everyone please go check out Zinnia's The Life After Leaving podcast, because I was really excited to hear straight from an ex-Christadelphian what Christadelphianism is all about, because it's a really unique one.
And it is funny because if you go online and you go to ecclesia's websites, I feel like they all have the same couple of sentences on every website, and it just never goes in deeper. So I try to go in deeper and still make it accessible. So I'll tell you who people are and the context you need to understand things, but make it so that you can actually really know, like, who are the Christadelphians and should I be concerned about them?
Everyone should look at their new religion if they're thinking of converting with a critical eye, or even the religion they're in with a critical eye.
Yeah, I'm surprised by how many Christadelphians tell me they're listening. Like, no pressure, but I'm glad to hear there are people who are open-minded enough that they're curious to hear it from someone who does not have that bias anymore, but who does know it personally.
I mean, I'm sure there's a lot who just want to know what maybe happened to a friend or family member. What were they thinking when they left? And
Absolutely.
maybe that friend or family member has been on your podcast, but if not, they've been through a similar experience.
Yeah. I think it's good. There's definitely some people who develop more empathy for the people who left, and see the humanity in them, as opposed to just thinking about them in a very narrow way that they may have heard from the platform, from the brothers, like, oh, they just wanted to go sin. But when you actually hear their story, you're like, no, this was a person who was struggling and who may have not wanted to give that up. They may have really wanted to have that doctrine, but then they realized for whatever reason it wasn't going to work. So yeah, it has been good to hear about that too.
Amazing.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, that there's this assumption that if you're leaving the church, it's because you had a favorite sin that you want to dive into, and you abandoned faith for this great sin.
Exactly. Yeah, either that or only people who are abused leave, which is a weird one because you're kind of admitting that you have an abuse problem. But they also make it a personal feeling, like, oh, man, you got abused and then you let it ruin your faith? Oh, what a weakling. So I've also heard that twisted argument, which I very much disagree with.
That's awful. That's a terrible argument.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe your faith creates abusers.
Yeah.
That happens. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Zinnia, and all of our listeners as well. You can keep the conversation going on Facebook, Instagram, Discord, YouTube. We're all over the place.
Check out our Patreon and Spread Shop if you want to donate a little bit of moolah to this podcast to keep it going. And other than that,
thanks for joining us. Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.